it's Patrick Hutzel from IntensiveCareHotline.com, where we instantly improve the lives for families of critically ill patients in intensive care so that you can make informed decisions, have peace of mind, real power, real control, and so that you can influence decision making fast, even if you're not a doctor or a nurse in intensive care. This is another episode of Your Questions Answered, and in last week's episode I answered another question from our readers, and the question last week was, my dad is part of medical research in ICU. Can it cause harm in life-threatening situations? You can check out the answer to last week's question by clicking on the link below this video. In this week's episode of Your Questions Answered, I want to answer another frequently asked question from our readers, and the question this week is, what are the chances of survival after a tracheostomy? Let's look at that in more detail. So many families in intensive care come to us and they have this very question, what are the chances of survival after a tracheostomy? They often come to us with this very question when their loved one is on a ventilator with a breathing tube or endotracheal tube and can't be weaned off the ventilator. If their loved one can't be weaned off the ventilator and potentially needs a tracheostomy, wanting this question answered only makes sense. Other crucial questions that also need to be answered when your loved one potentially needs a tracheostomy are the following questions. Number one, how long can a breathing tube or an endotracheal tube stay in? And I'll put a link to answer that question below this video. And if you're watching this on YouTube, just click on the link below this video. That'll get you to our website where you have access to all the other questions answered as well. Another question that needs to be answered if your loved one potentially does need a tracheostomy is, how long should a patient be on a ventilator before having a tracheostomy? And again, I'll put a link towards that article and video below this video. Also, you might want to know what are the risks and benefits of a tracheostomy. Now, generally speaking, you might have heard me saying this before on this blog, and I say it again because it's so important to understand. The most important goal for families in intensive care is to get their loved one off the ventilator and the breathing tube or endotracheal tube in the first place. A tracheostomy has its time and its place, but only after all efforts have been maximized to get your loved one off the ventilator and the breathing tube or endotracheal tube. This is also being referred to as extubation or removal of the breathing tube. I have also documented and detailed some step-by-step instructions in how to get your loved one off the ventilator and the breathing tube and endotracheal tube in the first place. You can check out the article and video, How to Wean a Critically Ill Patient in Intensive Care off the Ventilator and the Breathing Tube. And again, I'll put a link to that article and video below this video. Now, in case you haven't heard me mentioning it before, you also need to keep in mind that if a tracheostomy is the only valid option for your critically ill loved one in intensive care or ICU, you need to keep in mind also that if you are in the United States, a tracheostomy is often a vehicle to get your loved one out of ICU into LTAC, also known as long-term acute care facility, often also being referred to as long-term weaning ventilation facility. Now, I can only warn you that you should never agree to have your loved one go into LTAC in the first place, because the only place where ventilated patients can be safely looked after is intensive care or intensive care at home. Why? Because in order to manage ventilation, tracheostomy and the weaning process, you need ICU doctors and ICU nurses. LTACs, from my perspective and experience, are a disaster and many patients die in LTAC. That's the unfortunate reality. A discharge into LTAC is also often happening prematurely in order to empty ICU beds without considering the clinical needs, because ICU beds are in such high demand. I have more information here why you should avoid LTAC at all costs, and it's part of an article, Can a Tracheostomy Be Reversed? And again, you can find a link to that article below this video. So now that you have a good understanding about the territory of ventilation, breathing tube or endotracheal tube and tracheostomy, now it's time to look at our original question: what are the chances of survival after tracheostomy? Here are some numbers and statistics that I reeled in from another website. Hospital and long-term outcome after tracheostomy for respiratory failure. The results: 429 patients were studied. Hospital mortality was 19%. Only 57% of survivors were liberated from mechanical ventilation. At 100 days, 6 months, 1 year and 2 years after discharge, 24%, 30%, 36% and 42% of hospital survivors had died, respectively. Patients liberated from mechanical ventilation and having their tracheostomy tubes removed had the lowest mortality rates, 8% at year 1. The mortality of ventilator-dependent patients was highest, 57%. 66 patients completed the SF-36 for functional status. Whilst emotional health was generally good, physical function was quite limited. So I have put a link towards that study below this video, and I have also put another link to another study which suggests fairly similar results and outcomes for patients with tracheostomy after respiratory failure. Now, what does that actually mean? Let me explain and break it all down for you. If 57% of survivors were liberated from mechanical ventilation, it doesn't actually say what happened to the tracheostomy. What do I mean by that? Many patients might actually be liberated from mechanical ventilation and yet they still need the tracheostomy. Why do they still need the tracheostomy? They need the tracheostomy for secretion management, swallowing difficulties and therefore aspiration, pneumonia risk and many other issues. Again, here is more information regarding tracheostomy and if it can be reversed. So you might want to check out what are the risks and benefits of a tracheostomy, and also can a tracheostomy be reversed. Also, if a tracheostomy can't be reversed and you or your loved one want to go home, the best next step is to engage a service like intensive care at home so the tracheostomy can be safely managed at home and keep you or your loved one out of hospital. And you may also want to look up tracheostomy care and tracheostomy care in the community on the intensivecareathome.com website. Next, if some patients on a ventilator and tracheostomy are unable to be weaned off mechanical ventilation and the tracheostomy, or if they take a lot longer than anticipated rather than staying in ICU long term, or even worse, going into LTAC, long-term acute care, the best option for long-term ventilation with tracheostomy is for your loved one to go home with a service like intensive care at home. Intensive care at home brings intensive care skills, including ventilator and tracheostomy competent nurses into the comfort of your own home 24 hours a day. This creates a win-win situation. First, it improves the quality of life for your loved one and for you as a family. Finally, you and your loved one can go home and relax because you have the professionals where you need them, which is in your own home. Number 2, it frees up bed capacity in intensive care. Number 3, it reduces the cost of an intensive care bed by 50%. Number 4, either long-term mechanical ventilation with tracheostomy at home is possible. And number 5, ventilation weaning at home is possible as well. The list of the advantages of going home with a service like intensive care at home is incomplete, but you get the idea. Everybody is winning with a service like intensive care at home, including hospitals. So go and have a look at intensivecareathome.com. Next, some patients on ventilation with tracheostomy during prolonged mechanical ventilation approach their end of life, unfortunately. But rather than prematurely and often inappropriately withdrawing treatment or quote-unquote pulling the plug, you still want your loved one to live. Therefore, you and your family can also use a professional service like intensive care at home for end-of-life care and palliative care at home, rather than end-of-life care in a sterile hospital or intensive care environment. Did you know that 75% of the population in developed countries want to die at home, and yet only 14% actually do die at home? Intensive care at home enables long-term ventilated patients with tracheostomy to approach their end of life at home. Again, this achieves the following advantages and creates a win-win situation. Number one, it improves the quality of end of life for your loved one and for you as a family. Finally, you and your loved one can go home and relax because you have the professionals where you need them, which is in the comfort of your own home. Number two, it frees up bed capacity in intensive care and in hospitals. Number three, it reduces the cost of an intensive care bed by 50%. And number four, it creates peace and harmony when you need it the most in the comfort of your own home. The list of the advantages of going home with intensive care at home is again incomplete, but you get the idea. Intensive care at home services are available for both adults and children, and you can see the full list service offerings again at the intensivecareathome.com website. Thank you for watching. So, how can you become the best advocate for your critically ill loved one? How can you make informed decisions, get peace of mind, control, power, and influence quickly whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care? You will get to that all-important feeling of making informed decisions, get peace of mind, control, power, and influence when you download your free Instant Impact Report now by entering your email below. In your free Instant Impact Report, you will learn quickly how to make informed decisions, get peace of mind, real power and real control, and how you can influence decision-making fast whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. Your free Instant Impact Report gives you in-depth insight that you must know whilst your loved one is critically ill or is even dying in intensive care. Sign up and download your free Instant Impact Report now by entering your email below. In your free Instant Impact Report, you will learn how to speak the secret intensive care language so that the doctors and the nurses know straight away that you are an insider and that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care. In your free report, you will also discover how to ask the doctors and the nurses the right questions. Discover the many competing interests in intensive care and how your critically ill loved one's treatment may depend on those competing interests. How to eliminate fear, frustration, stress, struggle, and vulnerability even if your loved one is dying. You will get 5 mind-blowing tips and strategies helping you to get on the right path to making informed decisions, get peace of mind, control, power, and influence in your situation. You will get real-world examples that you can easily adapt to your critically ill loved one's situation. How to stop being intimidated by the intensive care team and how you will be seen as equals. You will get crucial behind-the-scenes insight so that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care and how you need to manage doctors and nurses in intensive care, and it's not what you think. Thank you for tuning into this week's Your Questions Answered episode, and I'll see you again next week in another update. Make sure you also have a look at our blog section for more tips and strategies, or simply send me an email to support@intensivecarehotline.com with your questions. Also, have a look at our membership site intensivecaresupport.org for families of critically ill patients in intensive care. You can also call me. Find international phone numbers on the top of the website. Also, have a look at our ebook section, where you get more ebooks, videos, and audio recordings, and where you can also get one-on-one consulting and advocacy with me via Skype, over the phone, or via email by clicking on the relevant tabs on the top of the website. This is Patrick Hutzel from IntensiveCareHotline.com, and I'll see you again next week in another update.